All right, it's 9:30, guys. Let's start class. I'm going to be going over the poem today, theme from English B. Let's go ahead and share that screen with you. Uh, this is a poem by a famous poet named Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was part of the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote several poems. I like this one though. It's simple, it's straightforward, yet complex, has a lot of different things going on it. We'll have a quick lecture about this, then we'll talk a little bit about Flipgrid and what I expect from your novel groups, and then I'll let you guys go ahead and get to work. So this is Theme from English B by Langston Hughes. The instructor said, go home and write a page tonight, and let that page come out of you. Then it will be true. I wonder if it's that simple. I am 22, colored. Born in Winston-Salem, I went to school there, then Durham, then here to this college on the hill above Harlem. I am the only colored student in my class. The steps from the hill lead down into Harlem, through a park. Then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y, the Harlem Branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page. It's not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22, my age. But I guess I'm what I feel and what I see and hear. Harlem, I hear you. Hear you, hear me. We too. You, me, talk on this page. I hear New York too. Me? Who? Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present. Or records. Bessie, Bop, or Bach. I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So will my page be colored that I write? Being me, it will not be white. But it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American. Sometimes perhaps you don't want to be a part of me, nor do I often want to be a part of you. But we are, that's true. As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me, although you're older and white and somewhat more free. This is my page for English B. All right, lots going on in the poem there. Let's just do a quick summary. So the whole thing about the poem, the task was to go home and write a one-page essay tonight and let your writing come from your heart. It'll be true, right? All right, so the speaker says, is it really that easy? He's 22 years old. He's black. He was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He went to school in Winston-Salem, then in Durham, North Carolina. So now he's a student at Columbia University, which is on a hill above Harlem. That's in New York City. He's the only black student in the class, and he walks home from class down the hill into Harlem. On the way, crossing through a park, then St. Nicholas Avenue, 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue. Finally, he gets to the Harlem branch of the YMCA. He takes an elevator up to his room, and he sits down to write the poem you're reading now. It's hard to say what's true about me or you when you're 22 years old like he is. But if he had to guess, he'd say he's the sum of everything he sees, feels, and hears. He hears Harlem. I hear Harlem, and Harlem hears me, and together we're talking on this page. And he hears the rest of New York City as well. So who am I? Well, he enjoys eating, sleeping, drinking, and loving people. He likes to work and read, to learn new things and to understand life. I like it when I get a pipe for Christmas or some music, a record by Bessie Smith, a bebop record, or something by Bach. Even though he's black, he still likes all the same things people like of other races. So will this essay that I'm writing also be black? If it really is me, then it won't be white. But it will be a part of the teacher, and he's white. But he's also part of this black student, just like he is the black student's a part of him. That's what being American means. Sometimes you don't want to be a part of me, and sometimes I don't want to be a part of you either, but we're still a part of each other, really. And just as I learned from you, you learned from me, even though you're older, white, and also freer than I am. And this is his writing assignment. All right. So lots of things going on here. Lots of things about race, identity, belonging. Um, it's about the complexities of identity in a racist society, right? He grew up in the early 1900s. This was written about 1950. So yes, we had the 13th Amendment where the slaves were set free, but we really didn't have racial or civil equality yet. Um, and the student, who is the only black kid in his class, is given this straightforward assignment to write that page. But it raises really complicated questions for the speaker about who he really is, about the relationships he has with the black and white people, and what it means to really be American. And as he works through these questions, the speaker arrives at a powerful argument against racism, right? And for his own place in American life. Black and white are truly not separate, the speaker argues. Instead, they are part of each other. The poem begins with a simple assignment, right? Like go home and write a page. But the professor, who's white, places the restriction that it has to be true. For the speaker, as a black man, he's unsure of how to proceed. He says in line 16, it's not easy to know what is true for you or me. At the heart of the poem is this question about relationships between race and identity. The speaker wants to know whether race determines his identity. He asks, will the page be colored that I write? The answer is that the speaker finally arrives at is really complex. Race is obviously important to his identity. So being me, the page that he writes will not be white. And yet, the things that actually define him, his habits and his passions and the hobbies he has no particular relationship to his race at all. He likes the same things other folks who are other races. To the speaker, race seems less like an intimate part of his identity and more like an imposition, like something used to classify him and to deny him these opportunities. The speaker also notes that race has created resentment and mistrust between himself and his professor. Sometimes the professor doesn't want to be a part of me, and equally the student doesn't want to be a part of you. Yet the speaker insists that they cannot deny this connection the way they're linked together. They're a part of each other because they are learning from each other. This is a really bold assertion, especially in a poem in the 1950s. The speaker is a black student in an overwhelmingly white institution. In fact, he's the only colored student in the room. He goes to point that out. It would be easy for him to feel alone and isolated, right, as the only person there. And it seems sometimes that he does. But he refuses to let that alienation obscure the underlying connection between himself and the professor. This connection that crosses race, age, and privilege. Even though the professor enjoys a prestigious job and is somewhat more free than the speaker, simply because the professor is white, they still learn from each other. As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me. The theme for English B is thus it's honest and direct about racism in the way that it awards white people unfair privileges in American society, but simultaneously it refuses to believe that racism defines American society. Just the contrary is true. This is what the speaker argues. That what makes both the professor and the student American is the way that they are related to each other, the way they are both part of each other. And in order to recognize what truly American, both student and professor need to recognize the way that racism has obscured deep connections between the two of them. Written in the early 50s as the civil rights movement was kind of gaining steam, this poem, theme for English B, makes a powerful case that being American is more about the connections that bind these communities together, despite the very real prejudice that separates them. Let's get into another major theme of the poem. He talks about the hill several times. Um, to this college on the hill above Harlem. Okay, Columbia University, where he went, it sits on a hill, a physical hill, above this historically black community of Harlem. The speaker is describing like literal geography of New York City. Okay, it's on a hill. But the speaker also uses this hill as a symbol for the sense of like superiority and entitlement and almost white privilege that surrounds the school. It's an Ivy League university, very prestigious, very selective at who gets in, right? After all, this hill puts Columbia literally above Harlem so that the university looks down on it. The very positioning of the university conveys a sense of power and authority and superiority over the neighborhood. But more generally, this symbol of the hill is an important place in like American life. So there's a description of the first governor of Massachusetts makes about his colony in like 1630. He describes it as a shining city on a hill. So a model of Christian piety and virtue, right? Like, because that's why Massachusetts was founded. He hoped that would inspire the rest of the world. And Americans have often thought of their country in these terms as a model for the rest of the world, right? Above and separate from everything else. So using the hill as a symbol here, the speaker also alludes to this tradition of American being above and better than everybody else. But he also like implicitly criticizes it, right? Like we're supposed to be separate, we're supposed to be better. Um, but are we really, and why? What about us makes us better? Columbia, the university he was at, the isolation it has on the hill is a result of this segregation that he feels. It's a refusal to interface with the vibrant neighborhood of Harlem just beyond the gates. And as the speaker talks about it, counting off the streets he has to cross on the way home, it's just a short walk, but it's seemingly worlds apart from each other. The speaker's use of this symbol kind of suggests the myth about America's exceptional status and that how we get to the top is by being superior over, like, relying on the segregation and the racism that gets there. There's also a couple of other interesting things that happen figuratively, and he uses different poetic devices. If you notice, some lines, like I wonder if it's that simple, stop at the end. This is called an end stop line. Here's an end stop line. And then we have some enjambment where the line continues. I went to school there, then Durham, then here to this college above the hill, on the hill above Harlem. This is a complete sentence that takes 2 lines, so it doesn't stop. So that's a couple of things. And usually when there's an end stop, there's some sort of closure of an idea there. When there's some enjambment going on, there's a separation for purpose. So I went to school there, then Durham, then here. Okay? He's telling you where he's at. But it's separated by the idea to this college on the hill above Harlem. So it emphasizes, here is emphasized by the next line. You can go through and find a lot of these end stops and enjambments and really look at the fact, why was this needed to be taken to the next line? And why did he not continue his line? Look at this one right here. But it will be a part of you, instructor. Why is there enjambment there? He could have just carried this line on. What's the poet trying to tell you by separating these 2 or 3 or 5 ideas into separate lines? Talked about the enjambment. There's a little bit of alliteration going on. That's the Harlem Hill, the same initial sound repetition. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words. A little bit of assonance too going on. Assonance is with vowel sounds instead of consonant sounds. So I feel and see and hear Harlem. I hear you. Repetition of those lines the assonants, O sounds, I sounds. Line 6 has a lot of I. I wonder if it's that simple. Repetition of the I sound. There's 4 of those there. Okay. The whole poem itself, let's talk about the poem being a metaphor, right? So the poem itself is very direct. It's very unpretentious. As the speaker wrestles with serious, difficult questions about race, identity, and belonging, he mostly avoids using like flashy poetic language, right? Like this is all, his diction is pretty simple here. The poem contains no similes and only a few metaphors, so hopefully it can reach and connect to a wide number of people. The metaphors it does contain tend to be understated, though. They don't stick out and disrupt the whole poem. Instead, they quietly support the questions it raises and the answers at which the speaker eventually arrives. A good example is line 18, when the speaker describes how he hears Harlem. Okay? I hear. Harlem, I hear you. Hear you, hear me. We too. The reader can interpret this literally, like the speaker is hearing sounds of Harlem from outside his window. But it could also be a metaphor for the speaker's relationship with Harlem. He understands its culture, so he hears its demands and complaints about life in a racist society. The line works both ways, literally and metaphorically, and in both ways it quietly adds urgency to the speaker's investigations into his relationship between race and identity. When the speaker does begin to talk about his understanding of race and identity, he relies on another metaphor to do so. The idea is complicated and challenging enough that he needs the support of this metaphor to explain what he's thinking. But it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, and yet a part of me, as I am a part of you. The speaker and the professor aren't literally a part of each other. They have separate bodies. Rather, it's a metaphor for all the things they share as Americans. A common history, language, culture, and a common feature, right? Indeed, it's just they're a part of each other, and they aren't whole unless we're all bound together. The metaphor suggests that America itself isn't whole unless black people and white people recognize the ways in which they are so linked together that it can't come apart. Despite racist laws and attitudes that try to separate black communities from white ones. Although theme from English B largely favors literal, unpretentious language, as we can see, the metaphor that this has, this being a part of one another, is at the heart of the argument this poem makes against racism. Last thing is repetition. He does use repetition in a couple different places to pretty good effect. Up here, I feel and see and hear. He uses hear like 4 or 5 times right here in this short area. Okay? The repetition of here, it allows the speaker to reflect on the way his relationship with Harlem and that larger black community we talked about is reciprocal. They hear each other. If we take it as a metaphor, they understand each other and they're sensitive to each other's concerns. The other important repetition comes down here. A part of me, part of you. We have part of you here again. Part of me, part of you. He's repeating it a lot. And this is that main metaphor, right? That bold assertion. He's really arguing that white and black people should not be separated or segregated. And this was coming at a time when they were often forced into separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Okay? He uses that repetition and the parallelism of being a part of each other to emphasize how radical this argument is. Because 2 parts of the sentence are equal and equivalent grammatically, right? Like a part of, a part of. It suggests that the white and black professor and student should also be equal, legally, politically, and culturally. Okay, so definitely bold statement during this time for Langston Hughes to make. It's a simple form poem. Basically a dramatic monologue. 22-year-old black student. He says that right here. Although we never know if it's male or female. There's never an inkling in here um, to say that the speaker, remember we separate speaker from author. Speaker in this poem is male. Never says that at all. So um, it could be written from the female point of view too. And if you want to look into that more, on the hill above Harlem, there are two schools. One is Columbia, which was all male until 1983, and the other, I think it's called Brenton's, and it was the female college. So it could be written from either male or female point of view. But it's got 5 stanzas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's written in free verse. There's no real rhyme scheme here. The thing that he does use to help move the poem along are some of the repetition that I talked about earlier. That really helps move it along into building speed and diction. There's a couple of things that, while they might have some sort of close rhyme, they're not meant as sort of a rhyming pattern. When he's talking about you, there's a lot of same words at the end that rhyme. It's just not meant to be a specific pattern or rhyme scheme. The speaker, we talked about it. The speaker is 22-year-old black student. We think going to Columbia. Oh, it's Barnard. Barnard College, not Brenton. Barnard. I have it in my notes here. It's the women's college affiliated with Columbia. So it might be at Columbia or Barnard. We don't know. The speaker also reveals that he's black. He grew up in the South, where racism was even more prevalent. He's described studying 2 places, Winston-Salem and Durham. Those are both large cities in North Carolina before he came up to Columbia. Now he lives in Harlem. Harlem is a predominantly black neighborhood just to the north of the school Columbia. And throughout the poem, the speaker reflects on the difficulties of being a black student in a largely white university. Only colored student in the class, he struggles to define himself in the face of the white racism he has to face every day. And this innocent assignment that the teacher offers to write a 1-page long paper explaining who he is, it kind of makes him search into his own identity and his relationship with the life that he has. Like I said, context, we have, this was originally published in 1951. It was published as part of Langston Hughes' 13th book of poetry, The Montage of a Dream Deferred, which is another poem that he has, The Dream Deferred. It came relatively late in Hughes' career. Hughes died in 1967, so this was about 16 years. As a young man, though, Langston Hughes was a leader of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was this literary and cultural movement that really championed black artistic and intellectual expression. And as a result, Langston Hughes became one of the most important poets of the 20th century, someone to whom younger poets often turn to as a model. This Harlem Renaissance that he was heavily a part of, it started in the 1920s, and it included several writers. It saw a development of jazz music, influences which we see in other poems by Hughes. And although it seems to be set in the 50s, Theme for English B seems to reflect an earlier time in Hughes's life, when he himself was a student at Columbia during the 20s. This experience Hughes found deeply alienating and uncomfortable, being the only black person at this prestigious Ivy League, basically white man's college. The division that the poem draws between Columbia and Harlem reflect Hughes's own experience moving between the two spaces. One was openly hostile and racist toward him, and the other was vibrant, full of energy, and something he can immerse himself in. So that sets up this great dichotomy. As the speaker wrestles with his own sense of belonging in this racist society, the poem seems to do the same, asking whether universities like Columbia will acknowledge the accomplishments and the cultural energy of the Harlem Renaissance and the people of color more generally. It was likely written just before it was published. Many African Americans had bravely served in World War II just before this, giving lives for their country, but they returned to a land that denied them their basic civil rights, including the right to vote. As the poem was written, this frustration with this unjust situation was building and beginning to boil over, and it would soon result in the American Civil Rights Movement, which black Americans across the country demanded equal rights. As the poem was being written then, many of the questions the speaker asked about his place as a black man in American society, about his relationship with his white people like his professor, they were urgent, pressing questions, both personal to him and at a national level. People were actively rethinking these issues at the time, interrogating the racist structures under which they lived. Although the poem doesn't explicitly acknowledge this context, we should nonetheless be understood its relation, because it has an active contribution to the pressing questions that were going on as this poem was published. Very, very powerful poem that was written by Langston Hughes. He does have a unique voice at the time. Being a black writer, he does have a lot of poems. Another great one is "A Dream Deferred." What happens to a dream deferred? Talks about the struggle of the African American people, of black people, and you see some of that reflected today, right? Like we can turn on the TV literally right now and probably see a protest going on somewhere about racial inequality, about Black Lives Matter, and the fact that, you know, look at this was written in the 1950s as a reflection of what happened in 1920, and here we are 100 years later in 2020, and we're still struggling with the same type of problems that they were having then. Yeah, it might not be out in the open, and yes, Colombia might have a higher number of African American and people of color, but if the civil rights movement solved everything, or made us all equal and gave them a voice, would we be having these problems today? How relevant is something like Theme from English B to a student as you today? No, I'm sure I haven't really looked, but it doesn't have to be only African American, right? It doesn't. Racism sees, it affects everybody. Latin American, even, I'm sure you guys have seen the news, the rants against Asian Americans, right? There was that crazy lady, where was it? She lives in Long Beach, and it was in, I can't think of it, but, really close, right? Really close. Why? Why is that stuff happening? And what are we doing to try and make that racial equality a thing, right? Yes, we have protests. Yes, we have this Black Lives Matter movement going on. This was this generation's build up, right? This was how they voiced their frustration. This was how they got their ideas across, through poetry, through music. We see a lot of that happening today. So even though this poem, like I said, written in 1950, about a time 100 years ago, still very relevant today, still very worth studying, because of the fact that even today we can look at this poem and see the differences, see the racial inequality and the injustice, and see the fact that if we need to move forward as Americans, yes, like he says about his instructor, yet you are white, yet a part of me as I am a part of you. That's American, right? And I think the more that this poem really says, the more that we are able to see each other as part of a whole and equal, the better off we can do to move forward. So that's our poem today, Theme from English B by Langston Hughes. Definitely, if you want to look up some of his other poems, click on his name. That'll take you to an awesome little biography about Langston Hughes. And then here we go. We got some more poems by Langston Hughes. It's got some really great poetry coming in here. Really easy to read, not like some of the poems where the very odd or archaic language, very simple, very easy to access. So definitely, if you are interested, there are some great poems here by Langston Hughes. Let's jump into teams real quick. Where's my teams? Alright. Teams, I am slowly picking away at your assignments. Please make sure they're getting turned in. I have these written down. I haven't entered them all. Make sure you're doing those check-in, guys. I had 6 yesterday. Here they are. I mean, if we don't want to do this, I can start emailing or messaging you individually. But I don't want to have to do that. So please get those Flipgrid done. If you're having a problem, let me know. I can help. I can get those, either some easier instructions or get you hooked up. It's something that needs to be happening right now. Let's see, chapter 4 through 6 study guide. You are going to have a quiz on chapters 4 through 6 tomorrow. Make sure that you have that study guide done. The quiz will be the same format that it was last time. I'm going to give you a code. You log into quizzes, and you take the quiz, and I will take your best score of 3, just like we did last time. That gives you 3 chances to kind of figure out what's going on. Let's talk about test taking strategies real quick. If I give you more than one time to take a quiz, have a pen and paper ready. And if you don't know the answer to a question, make sure you write that question down or the idea behind the question down. I'm giving you all the tools you need to get 100% on these quizzes. Please take advantage of that. Let's see, short story, mask, monkey's paw. All right, I still have 0 out of 29 turned in for Mask of the Red Death. Don't worry about that one. That's scheduled tomorrow. I have 8 out of 30 for Buffalo Bill. And these daily check-ins, once you're done, just turn it in. I could tell exactly how many people have done it. If you guys have any questions for me, I'll be on here. But if not, it is time for you to get to your novel groups and get working on that. Remember, Chapter 4 through 6 study guide will be due tomorrow, and you will have a quiz on chapters 4 through 6. If you have any questions, stay here and ask them. If not, off to your novel groups. I'll see you guys later.